The story of the T-34, the tank that would become the scourge of the German Wehrmacht, does not begin in a Soviet design bureau, but in a workshop in New Jersey, USA. Its foundational DNA was forged by a brilliant, irascible, and visionary American engineer named John Walter Christie, a man whose revolutionary ideas were too radical for his own country's military establishment. He was a prophet of armored warfare without honor in his own land, and his rejection by the United States Army would inadvertently gift the Soviet Union the technological seed for the most produced, and arguably most influential, tank of the Second World War. Christie was an eccentric genius, obsessed with speed and mobility. In the 1920s, when tanks were largely slow, lumbering infantry support weapons, often tethered to the pace of a walking soldier, Christie envisioned something entirely different: a fast, strategic weapon capable of independent, deep strike operations. He believed a tank's survival depended not on heavy, immobile armor, but on its ability to move rapidly, exploiting gaps in enemy lines and wreaking havoc in the rear. This philosophy was the antithesis of prevailing military doctrine on both sides of the Atlantic. His solution was a technological marvel: the Christie suspension system. Unlike traditional leaf spring suspensions that offered a rough, limited ride, Christie's design used large, independently mounted road wheels connected to massive coil springs housed within the tank's hull. This system allowed for an unprecedented range of vertical movement, enabling a tank to travel at high speed over rough, broken terrain without shaking itself or its crew to pieces. It was the key to achieving the strategic mobility he championed. But his innovation didn't stop there. His M1928 and M1931 prototypes featured another revolutionary feature: the ability to run either on its tracks for cross-country movement, or, after a 30-minute conversion by the crew, on its road wheels without its tracks for high-speed transit on roads. This convertible design could reach staggering speeds of over 70 miles per hour on wheels and 40 miles per hour on tracks, figures that were science fiction for any other contemporary armored vehicle. Christie tirelessly hawked his designs to the US War Department. He built spectacular, jaw-dropping demonstrators that would race and even jump over obstacles at exhibitions. Yet, the American military brass remained stubbornly unconvinced. They saw his tanks as overly complex, mechanically temperamental, and too lightly armored. The US Army, steeped in the doctrine of the infantry tank, could not grasp the operational concept Christie was selling. They wanted a slow, reliable machine to support foot soldiers, not a fast, strategic raider. His designs were rejected repeatedly. The bureaucracy, budget constraints, and institutional conservatism of the interwar US Army created an impenetrable wall against his revolutionary ideas. In frustration, Christie, ever the maverick, began looking for foreign buyers who might appreciate his vision. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Soviet Union was watching. Desperate to modernize the Red Army and transform it from a peasant force into a modern, industrial-era military, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had initiated a massive program of industrialization and technological espionage. The Soviet state was voraciously hungry for Western technology, and they saw in Christie's rejected tanks the very embodiment of their new deep battle doctrine, a theory that emphasized breaking through enemy lines and launching fast, powerful mechanized forces deep into the enemy's rear to disrupt command and logistics. The Christie tank was the perfect vehicle for this doctrine. In a clandestine operation that bypassed American arms embargoes, the Soviet Amtorg Trading Corporation, which served as a front for Soviet industrial espionage, purchased 2 of Christie's M1931 tanks in 1930. They were legally designated as farm tractors to circumvent US State Department restrictions on arms exports. These 2 disassembled prototypes, along with the blueprints and manufacturing rights, were smuggled out of the United States and shipped to the Soviet Union. The price was a pittance compared to the strategic value they would ultimately provide. The arrival of the Christie tanks in the USSR was a watershed moment. Soviet engineers at the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, KHPZ, tore them apart, studying, reverse engineering, and, crucially, improving upon the design. They discarded the complex and problematic wheel and track system, focusing entirely on the revolutionary suspension. They enlarged the design, added a more powerful engine, and began a process of iterative development that would lead to the BT, Bystrokodny tank, or Fast Tank, series. The BT-2, BT-5, and BT-7 became the cavalry tanks of the Red Army, famous for their blistering speed and the foundation of Soviet armored theory throughout the 1930s. John Walter Christie, the brilliant American rejected by his own country, had provided the spark. The Soviet Union, with its ruthless focus on practical application and mass production, would fan that spark into a firestorm. The Christie suspension, born in American obscurity, would become the mechanical heart of the BT tanks and, ultimately, the direct ancestor of the T-34. The nightmare for Hitler's panzer divisions was conceived not in the steppes of Russia, but in the mind of an unappreciated visionary from New Jersey, whose revolutionary farm tractor would one day roll east to meet the German invasion in a clash that would decide the fate of the world. In the decade following the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union stood as a pariah state, ideologically opposed to the capitalist West and technologically crippled by years of civil war and imperial collapse. The Red Army was a massive but antiquated force, a relic of a bygone era utterly unprepared for modern, industrialized warfare. Joseph Stalin, a man of ruthless pragmatism, understood this vulnerability with chilling clarity. He knew that to survive and ultimately triumph in the coming conflict he believed was inevitable, the USSR needed to bridge a technological chasm of decades in a matter of years. This realization birthed a state-level strategy of breathtaking audacity and systematic cunning, the mass acquisition, assimilation, and improvement of Western military technology. The Soviet Union would not invent the tank. They would steal its blueprints, purchase its prototypes, and reverse engineer its soul to build an armored fist of their own. This grand strategy operated on multiple fronts, all orchestrated by the Soviet state. The primary instrument was the Amtorg Trading Corporation, established in 1924 in New York City. To the outside world, Amtorg was a legitimate commercial entity facilitating trade between the USSR and the United States, dealing in furs, timber, and other commodities. In reality, it was the central node of a vast espionage and technology acquisition network, answerable directly to the Soviet intelligence apparatus. Amtorg's agents, often posing as businessmen, scoured American and European industries for advanced technology. They attended trade shows, courted disgruntled engineers, and negotiated contracts for machinery, tools, and, most critically, complete prototypes of military hardware. Their mission was to legally purchase what they could and illegally acquire what they couldn't, exploiting the openness and commercial drives of the very systems their ideology sought to destroy. The Christie tank acquisition was the most famous, but far from the only, success of this campaign. While Christie's designs were rejected by a skeptical US Army, the Soviets saw their potential with perfect vision. The purchase of the 2M 1931 farm tractors was a masterstroke, but the Soviet net was cast much wider. They hired American and German engineers as consultants, bringing them to the USSR to directly transfer knowledge. They purchased the designs for the British Vickers 6-ton tank, which would become the basis for the Soviet T-26, one of the most numerous tanks of the 1930s. They acquired French tankettes and studied German automotive and aircraft engineering through the secret collaboration facilities established under the Treaty of Rapallo in the 1920s. The Soviet military-industrial complex was being built, brick by technological brick, with Western blueprints. This voracious appetite for foreign technology was driven by the Soviet military doctrine of deep operation or deep battle, glubokaya operatsiya. Developed by visionary Soviet marshals like Mikhail Tukhachevsky, this doctrine was a radical departure from the static warfare of World War I. It envisioned a simultaneous assault on the entire depth of the enemy's defenses. The initial echelons would breach the tactical zone, but the decisive blow would be delivered by massive, fast-moving second echelons, comprised of tanks, mechanized infantry, and paratroopers, that would pour through the breach, operating deep in the enemy's rear to destroy headquarters, logistics, and reserves, causing the entire front to collapse. This doctrine required a specific kind of weapon, not slow, heavily armored infantry tanks, but fast, reliable, and long-range vehicles capable of sustained independent operations. The tanks the Soviets were buying from the West, particularly the Christie design, were the only ones in the world that fit this theoretical requirement. The process, once a technology was acquired, was a testament to Soviet industrial discipline and ingenuity. A prototype like the Christie tank would not simply be copied. It would be subjected to intense scrutiny at specialized research institutes, such as the Moscow Automotive Institute and the Scientific Auto Tractor Institute, (NOTI). Teams of the USSR's brightest engineers would deconstruct it, analyzing every component. They would identify weaknesses, propose simplifications for mass production, and seek ways to adapt the design to the unique and brutal conditions of the Soviet Union, its vast distances, its primitive road network, and its harsh climate. The goal was never mere imitation. It was improvement. The complex convertible drive of the Christie was discarded as too finicky for a conscript army. The suspension, however, was recognized as genius and became the non-negotiable core of the new BT series tanks. This state-sponsored technological transfer created a paradoxical reality. While the capitalist West, mired in the Great Depression and clinging to conservative military doctrines, slowly developed its own armored forces, the Communist East was aggressively harnessing the West's own innovations. The Soviet Union was executing a form of industrial and military time travel, leaping from a backward agrarian state to a world leader in armored warfare theory and technology in less than a decade. They were building the army of the future using tools purchased from the present of their perceived enemies. By the mid-1930s, the fruits of this ambitious campaign were evident. The Kharkov Locomotive Plant, KHPZ, was producing the speedy BT tanks in large numbers. These vehicles, directly descended from the smuggled Christie prototype, became the pride of the Red Army's mechanized corps. They were the practical testing ground for the tactics of deep operation and the training vehicle for a generation of Soviet tank officers and designers. The stage was set. The Soviet Union had successfully shopped the world's military markets, and in doing so, had assembled the knowledge, the industrial base, and the practical experience necessary for its next, and ultimate, step. The lessons learned from the BT series, its speed, its mechanical layout, and the enduring brilliance of its suspension, would soon be fused with the hard lessons of combat to create a legend. The farm tractor from America had been studied, mastered, and was now ready to be reborn as something far more formidable. The arrival of the disassembled Christie M 1931 prototypes in the Soviet Union was not the end of a procurement process, but the beginning of a technological revolution. The crude, powerful machines were not destined to remain mere copies. They were to become the raw genetic material for an entirely new breed of Soviet armor. Under the harsh lights of the Kharkov Locomotive Plant, KHPZ, a team of brilliant and fiercely patriotic engineers began the process of translation, adapting an American maverick's vision to the brutal realities of the Soviet state and the exacting demands of a radical new military doctrine. The result was the BT, the Bystrokodny tank, the fast tank. This series would become the crucible in which the tactical and technical DNA of the legendary T-34 was forged. The initial models, the BT-2, were essentially Soviet-built Christies, and they were fraught with teething problems. The complex convertible drive system, allowing the tank to run on wheels or tracks, was a maintenance nightmare. The original American Liberty engine was unreliable and underpowered for the vehicle's weight. The armament was a hodgepodge, with some models mounting a 37mm gun and others only machine guns. Yet, even with these flaws, the BT-2 revealed its transformative potential. Its speed was nothing short of breathtaking. On tracks, it could reach 40 miles per hour, and on its wheels, it could fly across roads at over 70 miles per hour. This was a performance that dwarfed every other tank in the world. For the first time, Soviet commanders had a weapon that could not only keep pace with, but far outrun, traditional cavalry. This raw speed was the perfect physical manifestation of the Red Army's emerging deep battle, glubokaya operacja, doctrine. Developed by visionary military theorists like Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Vladimir Tryandafilov, deep battle was a symphony of destruction designed to break the stalemate of trench warfare forever. It rejected the idea of a single, concentrated breakthrough point in favor of simultaneous attacks across a wide front to overwhelm the enemy's entire command and control system. The initial shock echelons would create gaps, but the decisive blow was to be delivered by fresh, highly mobile exploitation echelons. These forces were to pour through the breaches, not stopping to reduce strongpoints, but racing dozens or even hundreds of miles into the enemy's rear. Their mission was apocalyptic: to destroy headquarters, seize key terrain, interdict supply lines, and annihilate reserves, causing the entire enemy front to collapse from within. The BT tank, with its unprecedented strategic mobility, was conceived as the spearhead of this devastating second echelon. It was the weapon that could turn a tactical penetration into an operational-level catastrophe for the enemy. As the BT series evolved through the 1930s, each iteration refined the formula based on rigorous testing and expanding industrial experience. The BT-5 introduced a more powerful and reliable M5 engine and standardized a proper 45mm main gun, giving it serious anti-armor capability. The BT-7, the pinnacle of the series, featured a more streamlined, welded hull, a superior M17T engine, a licensed version of the German BMW 6, and enhanced armor protection. Crucially, Soviet engineers, led by figures like the gifted Mikhail Koshkin, were learning to simplify the design for mass production and improve its ruggedness. The problematic convertible drive, while retained, was increasingly seen as a superfluous complexity. The tank's performance on its robust, Christie-derived tracks was more than sufficient. The BT tanks were not just machines, they were mobile classrooms. They provided the Red Army with its first large-scale experience operating a sophisticated, modern armored vehicle. The vast maneuvers held in the Ukrainian and Belarusian military districts, though often chaotic, were laboratories for deep battle. Commanders learned the challenges of coordinating fast-moving armored columns, of logistics over great distances, and of combined arms warfare. The tanks themselves were tested to their limits, revealing weaknesses that would inform future designs. The relatively thin, vertical armor was a known vulnerability. The cramped, twin-turret layout on some early models was inefficient. The gasoline engines were fire hazards. Every one of these lessons was meticulously logged and analyzed. The BT series proved that the Christie suspension was a triumph, providing an unmatched blend of speed and cross-country ride quality. It confirmed the necessity of a powerful, dedicated tank gun, and it glaringly highlighted the need for better survivability. The concept of sloped armor, which could dramatically increase effective thickness by encouraging shell deflection, was already being discussed theoretically. The experience of driving and fighting in the BTS created a consensus among Soviet designers about what the ideal tank should be. It must have the BT speed and mobility, a gun powerful enough to engage any potential enemy, and armor sloped on all sides to maximize protection without the penalty of excessive weight. By the late 1930s, the BT series had served its purpose. It had been the vehicle that allowed the Red Army to practice and refine the most advanced armored doctrine in the world. It had trained a generation of designers, engineers, and tankers. And, most importantly, it had provided a clear and proven list of requirements for its successor. The fast tank had run its race. The lessons learned from its successes and its failures were now converging into a single, focused project. The stage was set for Mikhail Koshkin and his team to take the final, revolutionary step, to combine the brilliant suspension of the BT with a powerful diesel engine, sloped armor, and a heavy gun into a single, perfectly balanced design. The BT was the talented and spirited predecessor. The T-34 would be the masterpiece that eclipsed it, a tank born from the marriage of American mechanical genius, Soviet industrial ambition, and the hard-won, bloody experience of the deep battle doctrine. By 1937, the brilliant run of the BT series was reaching its logical conclusion. The tanks were fast and effective, but the lessons of the Spanish Civil War and escalating conflicts with Japan on the Mongolian border were clear. The era of lightly armored cavalry tanks was ending. Anti-tank guns were becoming more powerful and ubiquitous. A tank needed not just speed, but protection and firepower to survive on the modern battlefield. In the intense, secretive atmosphere of the Kharkov Locomotive Plant, KHPZ, a small team of designers, led by a quiet but iron-willed engineer named Mikhail Koshkin, embarked on a project that bordered on insubordination. Their goal was not to create another incremental improvement, but to design a completely new tank that would synthesize every hard-won lesson of the past decade into a single, revolutionary machine. This was the birth of the T-34. Koshkin was not the original chief designer. He was the deputy to the gifted but often impractical Afanasy Fursov. However, in the paranoid purges of Stalin's Great Terror, Fursov was arrested as a saboteur, a fate that befell many of the Soviet Union's top engineers. Koshkin was appointed in his place, inheriting a department living in fear and a project, the BT-20, which was meant to be the next evolution of the BT series. But Koshkin had a grander vision. He understood that the Red Army needed a universal tank, one that combined the strategic mobility of the BT with the protection of a heavy tank and the firepower to defeat any known enemy armor. He fought tirelessly with the military bureaucracy, which was often conservative and resistant to radical change, arguing for a departure from the BT lineage. The project was designated A-20 and A-32, later T-32. The A-20 was the conservative option, adhering closely to the military specifications. It featured the BT's convertible drive and 20 mm of armor. Koshkin, however, passionately championed the more radical A-32. His arguments were a masterclass in tactical foresight and engineering logic. He insisted on removing the complex and heavy convertible drive, arguing that the Christie suspension alone provided more than enough mobility and that the weight savings could be used for thicker armor. Most critically, he fought for a dramatic increase in armor protection and, audaciously, for the tank to be designed to accommodate a more powerful gun than the standard 45 mm. He envisioned a 76.2 mm gun, a caliber previously reserved for heavy tanks, mounted on a medium tank chassis. Koshkin's unwavering advocacy, backed by rigorous calculations and prototypes, eventually won the day. In a high-stakes demonstration before the State Commission in the summer of 1939, both the A-20 and the A-32 were put through their paces. The A-32, with its thicker, sloped armor and wider tracks, proved its superiority. It was just as fast and agile as the A-20, but its potential for survivability and firepower was in a different league. The Commission, impressed, gave Koshkin the green light to develop an even more heavily armored version of the A-32. This was the final, decisive step. The new prototype, now designated T-34, incorporated all of Koshkin's key innovations into a single, formidable package. The T-34 prototype was a masterpiece of integrated design, where every component served multiple purposes. Its most iconic feature was its sloped armor. Every major plate, the front glacis, the sides, even the turret, was angled. This was not a new concept, but no tank had ever implemented it so thoroughly and effectively. A sloped plate increases the effective thickness of the armor a shell must penetrate. A 45mm plate sloped at 60 degrees presents over 90mm of effective steel. It also dramatically increases the chance of a shell ricocheting harmlessly away. This gave the T-34 a level of protection equivalent to a much heavier, slower vehicle. For power, Koshkin turned to a new, revolutionary engine, the V2 diesel. This was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering in its own right. Unlike the gasoline engines that powered most of the world's tanks, and the BT series, the V2 was a high-performance, 12-cylinder diesel. It offered tremendous power for its weight, was far more fuel-efficient, granting the T-34 an incredible operational range, and, most importantly, was much less flammable. Diesel fuel is far less volatile than gasoline, meaning a penetrating hit was less likely to turn the T-34 into an inferno, a life-saving feature for its crew. The marriage of the Christie suspension with this New Holland engine was sublime. The large, independently sprung road wheels allowed the T-34 to fly over rough terrain that would immobilize or cripple German Panzers. Its wide tracks gave it exceptionally low ground pressure, enabling it to traverse muddy fields and snow that would bog down its adversaries. It was a tank designed for the vast, unforgiving landscape of Russia itself. The final piece was the F-34 76.2mm gun. When it was mounted, the transformation was complete. The T-34 could engage and destroy any German tank of 1941 from a safe distance, while its own sloped armor was largely invulnerable to the standard 37mm and 50mm guns of the Panzer IIIs and IVs. But the project was almost stillborn. The military bureaucracy, while impressed, was hesitant to disrupt production of the existing BT and T-26 tanks. To prove his tank's worth beyond any doubt, Koshkin undertook a desperate gamble. In early 1940, he ordered 2 pre-production T-34 prototypes to be driven from the factory in Kharkov to Moscow for a demonstration for Stalin himself, a journey of over 1,200 kilometers. The tanks, plagued by mechanical teething problems, were driven in brutal winter conditions, often off-road to avoid damaging public roads. Koshkin, already in poor health, rode in one of the tanks, personally overseeing the journey. The stunt was a spectacular success. The tanks arrived in Moscow, performed flawlessly before the Soviet leadership, and won Stalin's definitive approval for mass production. However, the exertion and the cold cost Koshkin his life. He contracted pneumonia and died in September 1940, just as his masterpiece was entering production. Mikhail Koshkin never saw his tank in combat. He never witnessed the shock it would inflict on the German army or its decisive role in saving his homeland. He was the unsung architect of a weapon that would become a legend, a man who defied bureaucracy, bet his career and his health on a radical idea, and died ensuring that the Kharkov secret would become the Red Army's sharpest sword. The T-34 was not a collection of innovative features. It was a single, unified weapon system where every component was optimized for a brutal, utilitarian purpose, winning a war of attrition on the most demanding battlefield on Earth. Its genius lay not in technological wizardry, but in a philosophical commitment to what would later be called combat effectiveness. It was a masterpiece of martial ergonomics, where the triad of sloped armor, a powerful gun, and a revolutionary diesel engine were fused into a design of such perfect balance that it would redefine tank warfare for a generation. This was not a tank built for parades or for the delicate sensibilities of its crew. It was a machine built for survival, production, and killing. The most visually distinctive and psychologically jarring feature for its enemies was its sloped armor. While angled armor was a known theoretical concept, no tank had ever implemented it so thoroughly and ruthlessly. The T-34's hull was a masterpiece of geometric defense. The front glacis plate was a single, massive piece of 45mm thick rolled homogeneous armor, sloped back at a dramatic 60-degree angle. This simple tilt transformed its protective quality. In practical terms, a shell striking this plate would have to penetrate the diagonal length of the steel, which equated to over 90 millimeters of effective thickness, more than double its actual mass. Furthermore, the steep angle created an extremely high probability of ricochet, causing armor-piercing shells to simply skate off harmlessly. This principle was applied across the entire vehicle. The sides of the hull were sloped, and the turret, though initially cramped and poorly designed with a single commander gunner, was also cast with pronounced slopes. This design achieved a phenomenal balance between protection and weight, giving the T-34 a level of survivability that was, in 1941, unmatched by any medium tank in the world. German tankers and anti-tank gunners found their standard 37mm PaK-36 guns, dubbed door knockers in frustration, and even the 50mm guns of the Panzer III, bouncing off the T-34's hide with alarming regularity. This formidable defense would have been meaningless without an equally formidable offense. The T-34 was armed with the F-34 76.2mm tank gun. This was a weapon of devastating power for its time. It could fire both high-explosive rounds for use against infantry and fortifications, and, most critically, a solid armor-piercing round that could punch through the frontal armor of any German tank it was likely to meet in 1941, the Panzer III, Panzer IV, and even the Czech-built models, at standard combat ranges of 500 to 1,000 meters. The combination was terrifying. A German tank crew would watch in horror as their own shells ricocheted off the approaching Soviet machine, which could then calmly return fire with a weapon capable of destroying them with a single hit. This gun armor paradox, where the T-34 could kill its enemies but could not itself be easily killed, created the initial T-34 shock that rippled through the German army. The tank's design philosophy extended to its ammunition stowage. It carried a generous load of 77 rounds, ensuring it could sustain prolonged engagements, a critical feature for deep penetration operations. The element that gave this heavily armed and armored vehicle its legendary strategic mobility was its engine, the V2 diesel. In an era where nearly every other tank ran on highly flammable gasoline, the Soviet choice of a diesel power plant was a stroke of genius that saved countless crews' lives. The V2 was a 12-cylinder, 38.8-litre liquid-cooled diesel engine producing around 500 horsepower. Its advantages were manifold. First, and most importantly, diesel fuel is far less volatile than gasoline. When AT-34 was penetrated by a shell, it was significantly less likely to erupt in a catastrophic fuel fire, the grim fate that earned gasoline engine tanks like the American Sherman the nickname Ronsons. Second, diesel engines are inherently more fuel efficient. This gave the T-34 an phenomenal operational range of over 400 kilometers on its internal fuel tanks, a crucial asset for the vast expanses of the Eastern Front where fuel logistics were a constant nightmare. Third, the V2 was remarkably robust and powerful for its weight, giving the 26-ton T-34 a superb power-to-weight ratio and a top speed of over 50 kilometers per hour on roads. This engine, coupled with the proven Christie suspension with its large, independently sprung road wheels, allowed the T-34 to maintain a speed and cross-country mobility that German tanks, with their complex, maintenance-intensive torsion bar systems, could not match, especially in the deep mud of the Rasputitsa, the spring and autumn mud seasons, and the heavy snows of the Russian winter. The design's brutal simplicity was most evident in its manufacturing and maintenance philosophy. The T-34 was designed from the outset to be built quickly, cheaply, and in staggering numbers by a workforce that included many unskilled laborists. Its components were simple and rugged. The hull was largely composed of flat, sloped plates that were easy to fabricate and weld. While early models suffered from rough finish and mechanical teething problems, the core design was sound and was continuously refined for ease of production, not crew comfort. The interior was cramped, noisy, and Spartan. The crew of 4 worked in arduous conditions, but the machine itself was a testament to the Soviet principle of good enough. It did not need to be perfect. It needed to be reliable, capable, and numerous. This philosophy of brutal simplicity, focusing on the 3 key pillars of sloped armor, a powerful gun, and a mobile diesel engine, created a tank that was perfectly suited for the war it was about to fight. It was a weapon that could be produced by the tens of thousands, could survive on the battlefield, and could kill anything the enemy sent against it. In the T-34, the Soviet Union had not just a tank, but the perfect instrument for its war of patriotic survival. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, which began on June 22, 1941, was designed as a swift, surgical campaign of annihilation. The Wehrmacht, confident from its unbroken string of victories in Poland and the West, expected to encounter a disorganized, primitive Red Army equipped with obsolete weapons. The initial days of the invasion seemed to confirm this arrogance, as German panzer divisions sliced through Soviet frontier defenses, encircling entire armies and taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But within weeks, a new and terrifying reality began to dawn on the frontline German soldiers, a reality that would shatter their belief in their own invincibility and send shockwaves all the way to Hitler's Wolf's Lair. This was the shock of the T-34. The first encounters were fragmented and surreal. A German panzer column, advancing confidently down a dusty Russian road, would be engaged from an extreme range. The standard German anti-tank gun, the 37mm Pak-36, would open fire. The crews would watch, expecting the enemy tank to burst into flames. Instead, they would see the tracer rounds spark and ricochet high into the air with a shrieking whine. The Soviet tank, seemingly impervious, would continue its advance, return fire with a massive flash from its 76.2mm gun, and obliterate a German Panzer III or IV with a single hit. Reports from the front were met with disbelief at higher headquarters. Veterans of the French campaign spoke of a new, monstrous Soviet tank that their weapons could not harm. The T-34's advantages were a perfect counter to the German arsenal of 1941. The German Panzer III, the main battle tank designed to fight other armor, was typically armed with a 50mm kilowatt K38 LR42 gun. This weapon was utterly inadequate against the T-34's sloped frontal armor except at point-blank range or from the side. The Panzer IV, at this stage still an infantry support vehicle, carried a short-barreled 75mm howitzer that was useless for anti-tank work at range. The standard German infantry anti-tank weapon, the 37mm Pak-36, was so ineffective that it was grimly nicknamed Heeresanklopgerat, the Army Door Knocker, by its frustrated crews. They were literally tapping on the T-34's hull, unable to get in. The T-34, in contrast, could destroy any German tank it encountered from over 1,000 meters away. This technological superiority created a profound psychological crisis, the T-34 Shark Dash, among German troops. For the first time, the German soldier faced an enemy with a clear, qualitative technological edge. The T-34 was not just better in one area, it was better in the three most critical categories: armor, firepower, and mobility. Its sloped armor made it a ghost, seemingly immune to their fire. Its 76mm gun was a sledgehammer that could kill them with ease. And its wide tracks and powerful diesel engine allowed it to traverse muddy or snow-covered terrain that would immobilize the narrower-track German panzers. The T-34 could appear from swamps and forests considered impassable, strike hard, and disappear before the Germans could bring their superior tactics and coordination to bear. The myth of German technical and tactical invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1939, was broken. German commanders were forced to resort to desperate, costly measures to counter the T-34. The only reliable ways to destroy it were with the high-velocity 88mm flak guns, which had to be rushed forward from their anti-aircraft role to serve as emergency tank destroyers, or with close assault teams of infantry using magnetic hollow charge mines and grenade bundles. Both methods were incredibly dangerous and exposed the German soldiers to tremendous risk. Stuka dive bombers were also called in, but they required air superiority, which was not always guaranteed. The sheer shock of the T-34's performance directly catalyzed a frantic German technological response, leading to the rapid upgunning of the Panzer IV with a long 75mm cannon and the emergency development of entirely new tanks, the Panther and the Tiger, specifically designed to counter the Soviet machine. Despite this devastating tactical performance, the T-34 could not halt the German advance in 1941. The chaos of the Soviet collapse, the decapitation of the Red Army's leadership by Stalin's purges, and the brilliant German operational maneuvers meant that T-34s were often thrown into battle piecemeal, without proper logistical support, command and control, or combined arms coordination. Many were lost to mechanical failure, a lack of fuel or ammunition, or simply being abandoned after outrunning their support. German combined arms tactics, superior optics, and full vehicle radios often allowed them to overcome individual T-34s by outmaneuvering and ambushing them. Yet, the shock of its debut had a strategic impact far beyond the number of tanks destroyed. It told the German High Command that they had fundamentally misjudged their enemy. The Soviet Union was not a backward colossus with feet of clay. It was an industrial power capable of producing a weapon that was, in many ways, a generation ahead of their own. It instilled a seed of doubt that would grow as the war dragged on. For the Red Army, The T-34 became a symbol of hope and a tangible proof that they could technically match and surpass the invaders. The shock of 1941 was a tactical defeat for the Soviet Union, but the debut of the T-34 was a portent of a coming storm. It was the first, clear sign that the Blitzkrieg was meeting its match, not in a brilliant general or a fortified line, but in the brutal, simple, and terrifyingly effective design of a tank that would soon be produced in the tens of thousands, a tidal wave of steel that would eventually roll all the way to Berlin. The initial encounters with the T-34 in the summer of 1941 did not just represent a battlefield setback for the Wehrmacht. They triggered a full-blown technological and doctrinal crisis within the German Panzer arm. The confidence born of victories over Poland, France, and the British in the desert was shattered against the sloped armor of the Soviet tank. A chilling realization swept through German tank crews and their commanders. Their standard-issue weaponry was obsolete. They were facing an enemy they could see, engage, and hit, but could not destroy. The T-34, in those early months, was not just a tank. It was a ghost that rendered the Wehrmacht's primary anti-tank systems nearly useless, forcing a desperate and costly scramble for a solution. The heart of the crisis was a catastrophic mismatch between German penetration and Soviet protection. The workhorse of the German anti-tank units was the 3.7 cm Pak-36. A competent weapon in 1939, it was now utterly outclassed. Its shells simply bounced off the T-34's glacis plate and rounded turret, with the sound German soldiers described as a high-pitched ping. In frustration and black humor, they christened it the Hirasanklopterat, the Army Dornocker, as its crews were merely announcing their presence to the impervious Soviet behemoths. The situation was scarcely better for the panzer divisions themselves. The main German battle tank, the Panzer III, was armed with a 5 cm kilowatt K38 LR42 gun. To achieve a kill, it had to close to suicidally short ranges of 100 meters or less and aim for the T-34's weaker side armor or its vulnerable turret ring, a near impossible task under fire from a tank that could destroy it from over a kilometer away. The Panzer IV, with its short-barreled 7.5 cm kilowatt K37 LR24 howitzer, was completely outranged and its shells were ineffective against the T-34's armor. This technological inferiority forced the German army to adopt brutal, stopgap tactics that traded German lives for time. The only weapon readily available that can reliably defeat the T-34 was the 8.8 cm Flak 1836, the legendary 88. But this was an anti-aircraft gun. It was heavy, difficult to maneuver, and not integrated into the Panzer or infantry division's standard tables of organization. These guns had to be hastily brought forward from the rear, their crews exposed as they labored to emplace the large, high-profile weapons in direct-fire roles. Using the 88 was effective, but it was a reactive, defensive measure that ceded the initiative to the Soviets. It symbolized a failure of the Panzer's own offensive capability. For the infantry, the situation was even more dire. Without an 88 nearby, they had to resort to close-quarter Panzerknacker, tankbuster, tactics. Squads would be sent out with bundles of hand grenades, magnetic hollow charge mines like the Haftal-Ladung, and explosive charges. Their orders were to let the T-34s pass their positions and then attack from the sides and rear, attempting to place charges on the engine deck or tracks. This was infantry fighting in its most primitive and terrifying form, a throwback to the trenches of World War I, pitting men with bombs against steel behemoths. The casualty rates for these teams were catastrophic. The shockwaves of this crisis reached the highest levels of the German command. Frontline commanders filed frantic reports detailing the inadequacy of their weapons. A famous demonstration was staged for General Heinz Guderian in late 1941, where a captured T-34 was fired upon by a Panzer III and a Panzer IV to prove the point. The shells ricocheted harmlessly. Guderian, the father of the German panzer forces, was horrified. He immediately understood the implications. The entire foundation of the Blitzkrieg was under threat. How could they achieve deep penetrations and encirclements if their spearhead could be blunted by a tank their own forces could not kill? The immediate response was a frantic program of upgunning existing vehicles. The Panzer IV, a robust and roomy design, was identified as the best platform for a new, high-velocity gun. The result was the Panzer IV Ausf. F2 and G models, equipped with the long-barreled 7.5 cm kilowatt K40 LR43 and later LR48. This gun could finally defeat the T-34's frontal armor at standard combat ranges, effectively transforming the Panzer IV from an infantry support vehicle into the Wehrmacht's primary tank killer for the middle years of the war. Simultaneously, the Panzer III was upgunned to a longer 5 cm kilowatt K39 LR60, though this provided only a marginal improvement. But these were interim solutions. The T-34 shock, combined with the encounter with the even heavier KV-1 tank, made it clear that Germany needed a completely new generation of armoured vehicles. This panic directly catalyzed the development of the two most famous German tanks of the war, the Panther and the Tiger. The Panther, in particular, was a direct, if over-engineered, response to the T-34. German engineers, after studying captured T-34s, were deeply impressed by its sloped armour, wide tracks, and powerful gun. The Panther incorporated all these features, adding German hallmarks of superior optics and a more powerful gun, the 7.5 cm kilowatt K42LA70. The Tiger, with its immense 8.8 cm kilowatt K36, was the heavy solution to the problem. The German Panzer crisis of 1941–42 was therefore a pivotal moment. It broke the Wehrmacht's technological momentum and forced it into a costly and resource-intensive arms race it was ill-prepared to fight. The stopgap measures and new tank programs diverted precious industrial capacity, steel, and fuel. The simplicity and numbers of the T-34 had forced Germany onto a path of building complex, expensive, and difficult-to-maintain wonder weapons. The crisis proved that the Soviet Union had won the first, critical round of the technological duel, not with a secret weapon, but with a better, more balanced, and more sensible design. The farm tractor's descendant had thrown the mighty German war machine into a state of emergency from which it would never fully recover. The shock of the T-34 and KV-1 on the Eastern Front in 1941 was more than a tactical problem for the German Wehrmacht. It was a profound ideological and psychological blow to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi High Command. The Führer's vision of the German soldier as a technologically superior Übermensch was being shattered by what he considered Slavic Untermenschen in a tank that was demonstrably better than anything his own industries had produced. This perceived humiliation, combined with the stark military reality that the Blitzkrieg had stalled before Moscow, triggered a characteristically extreme response. Hitler demanded not merely an answer to the T-34, but its absolute and overwhelming negation. He initiated a frantic technological arms race, bypassing the more cautious Army Ordnance Office and demanding the immediate creation of war-winning wonder weapons. This directive would birth two of the most legendary and fearsome tanks of the war, the Panzer V Panther and the Panzer VI Tiger. Yet, this path to technological redemption was fraught with the very German tendencies that would ultimately undermine their war effort: over-engineering, complexity, and a fatal disregard for the practicalities of mass production and logistics. The process began with a sense of genuine panic. In the spring of 1942, a special German military commission, the Panzer Commission, was dispatched to the Eastern Front to directly inspect captured T-34s and interview frontline troops. Their findings were a damning indictment of German tank design. They were awestruck by the T-34's combination of sloped armor, wide tracks, and powerful gun, features they had neglected in their own designs. The Commission recommended, to the shock of German industrialists, that Germany should simply copy the T-34 exactly to save time. This was politically unacceptable to Hitler. The idea that the master race would slavishly imitate a Slavic design was anathema. Instead, he ordered German industry to create a new tank that incorporated the T-34's best features but was built with German engineering superiority, making it bigger, heavier, and more powerfully armed. This directive led to the development of the Panther. The companies Daimler-Benz and MAN submitted proposals. The Daimler-Benz design was a near-carbon copy of the T-34, a pragmatic solution that could have been in production quickly. MAN's design was more conventionally German, with a front-mounted transmission and a complex, interleaved road wheel suspension. Despite its greater mechanical complexity, the MAN design was chosen, largely because its larger turret ring could accommodate a much more powerful gun. The resulting Panther was a technological marvel. It featured sloped armor that was even thicker than the T-34's, a superb high-velocity 7.5 cm kilowatt K42LA70 gun that could punch through the armor of any Allied tank at long range, and excellent optics. On paper, and in ideal conditions, it was arguably the finest medium tank of the war. Simultaneously, the need for a heavy breakthrough tank, spurred by encounters with the Soviet KV-1, led to the Tiger I. Where the Panther was a response to the T-34's balance of qualities, the Tiger was a response to its invulnerability. It was a brute force solution. Its design prioritized firepower and protection above all else. It mounted the dreaded 8.8 cm kilowatt K36 gun, derived from the legendary Flak 1836s, a weapon that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its frontal armor was a massive 100 mm thick, with no meaningful slope, making it virtually impervious to frontal attack from most Allied guns. It was a mobile fortress, designed to dominate the battlefield from a distance and crush any opposition through sheer, overwhelming power. However, this pursuit of qualitative supremacy came at a catastrophic cost. Both the Panther and Tiger were plagued by their own engineering brilliance. They were incredibly complex, over-engineered machines. The Panther's interleaved road wheels, which provided a smooth ride, were a maintenance nightmare. A simple inner wheel replacement could require the disassembly of half the suspension. Its final drive was notoriously weak and prone to failure, often giving out after just 150 kilometers. The Tiger, weighing 57 tons, was underpowered and guzzled fuel, straining the Wehrmacht's already precarious logistics. Its immense weight limited the bridges it could cross and made transportation by rail a complex ordeal requiring a change to narrower transport tracks. Most critically, they were disastrously difficult to mass-produce. A single Tiger required over 300,000 man-hours to build. A Panther required around 150,000. In stark contrast, a T-34-85 could be built in less than 10,000. This disparity in production efficiency was a war-losing equation. While German factories painstakingly assembled a few hundred technological marvels, Soviet factories were stamping out thousands of simple, robust T-34s. In 1943, the year of the Panther's debut at the Battle of Kursk, Germany produced just 1,848 Panthers. The Soviet Union produced 15,812 T-34s. The numerical imbalance was insurmountable. Hitler's response to the T-34, therefore, was a tragic paradox. In his drive to achieve absolute qualitative superiority, he committed Germany to a production strategy that guaranteed quantitative inferiority. The Panther and Tiger were terrifying on an individual level, and they racked up impressive kill ratios. But they could not be everywhere. They broke down on long marches. They ran out of fuel. They were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Soviet strategy was one of volume. For every Panther that broke through, 10 T-34s would be waiting. The German technological arms race, born from the shock of a farm tractor, produced magnificent killing machines, but it also consumed resources, skilled labor, and time that Germany could not spare. It was a desperate gamble on quality over quantity, and on the Eastern Front, where the battlefields were vast and the stakes were national survival, quantity had a quality all its own. The German response to the T-34, the Panther and Tiger, was a testament to engineering prowess and a commitment to qualitative superiority. The Soviet answer was the antithesis of this philosophy, a relentless, overwhelming focus on volume, simplicity, and continuous, pragmatic evolution. While German industry struggled to produce its complex wonder weapons, the Soviet Union embarked on one of the most staggering feats of military production in history. Their strategy was not to build a better tank than the Panther, but to build 5 good enough tanks for everyone the Germans could field, and to ensure that each new iteration of the T-34 could meet the evolving threat. This industrial doctrine found its ultimate expression in the T-34-85, the final, perfected form of the wartime T-34, a machine that balanced improved combat effectiveness with the unyielding demand for mass production. The foundation of the Soviet response was the evacuation and reorganization of its entire industrial base. As the German armies advanced in 1941 and 1942, a monumental effort was undertaken to dismantle over 1,500 factories from Western Russia and Ukraine and move them by train east of the Ural Mountains. This exodus of industry, carried out under unimaginable pressure, re-established production in vast new facilities safe from German bombers. The most famous of these, Tankergrad, the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, became a colossal complex where tanks rolled off assembly lines in buildings that span miles. Here, the principles of Henry Ford and American mass production were applied with Soviet single-mindedness. The T-34's design was perfect for this environment. Its components were simple, rugged, and designed for easy fabrication and assembly by a workforce that included a high percentage of women, teenagers, and unskilled laborists. The process was streamlined to an extreme. One factory famously painted its tanks with primer using a method akin to a car wash, and some applied their final green camouflage paint with brooms. This focus on volume, however, did not mean stagnation. Even as thousands of the original T-34-76 model poured from factories, Soviet designers were acutely aware of its growing shortcomings in the face of new German tanks. The T-34's greatest weaknesses in 1943 were its cramped, two-man turret and its increasingly outclassed 76.2mm gun. The tank commander also had to serve as the gunner, a crushing workload that hampered situational awareness and reaction time in a duel. Against the long-range killing power of the Panther's 75mm kilowatt K42 and the Tiger's 88mm kilowatt K36, the T-34-76 was at a severe disadvantage. The solution was the T-34-85. This was not a new tank, but a masterful evolution of the existing, proven design. The most critical change was the replacement of the small, cramped turret with a larger, cast, three-man turret. This single modification dramatically improved the tank's combat effectiveness. By adding a dedicated gunner and loader, the tank commander was freed to command, to observe the battlefield, direct the driver, and communicate with other tanks. This brought the T-34's crew coordination and reaction time up to German standards. To fit this new turret, the hull was slightly widened, and the turret ring was enlarged. The new turret was designed to house a significantly more powerful weapon, the ZASS 53 85mm tank gun. This gun was a direct response to the need to engage heavier German armor at longer ranges. While it still could not match the raw penetration of the Panther's long 75mm or the Tiger's 88mm gun at extreme range, it was a massive leap forward from the F-34 76.2mm. The 85mm gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther at typical combat ranges of 500 to 800 meters and was a deadly threat to the Tiger's weaker side armor. More importantly, it could easily destroy the Panzer IV and Stu G3, which still formed the bulk of German armored strength. The balance of firepower had been restored. The genius of the T-34-85 lay in its preservation of the original design's core strengths while decisively addressing its key weaknesses. It retained the legendary Christie suspension, the rugged V2 diesel engine, and the well-sloped armor profile. It was still simple to manufacture, reliable, and easy to maintain in the field. The addition of a radio as standard equipment, a luxury in earlier models, finally allowed for proper platoon-level tactics. The Soviet answer to German quality was not to try and out-German the Germans, but to enhance their own philosophy of robust, mass-producible effectiveness. The T-34-85 began rolling off assembly lines in late 1943 and became the standard Soviet medium tank by early 1944. Its impact was immediate. It entered service just as the Red Army was shifting from desperate defense to relentless, sweeping offensives. In the colossal armored battles of Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, which annihilated the German Army Group Center, the T-34-85 formed the core of the Soviet armored fist. It was fast enough for deep exploitation, reliable enough for long advances, and now powerful enough to engage any German tank it encountered with a reasonable chance of success. It was the perfect instrument for the war the Soviet Union was now fighting, a war of massive, combined arms assaults across a continent. By the end of the war, over 48,000 T-34s of all types had been built, with the T-34-85 constituting the majority of production from 1944 onward. The Soviet answer of mass production and pragmatic evolution had triumphed decisively over German over-engineering. The T-34-85 did not win because it was the best tank in the world in a one-on-one duel. It won because it was a good tank that could be built in stupefying numbers, operated by a well-trained crew, and integrated into a devastatingly effective combined arms system. It was the final, mature form of the design that had begun as an American farm tractor, a testament to the brutal, simple, and world-changing effectiveness of the Soviet industrial and military machine. By the summer of 1944, the character of the war on the Eastern Front had undergone a fundamental and irreversible transformation. The titanic clashes at Kursk had broken the back of Germany's offensive power. The initiative now belonged wholly to the Red Army, and it was an initiative expressed not in delicate maneuvers, but in the application of overwhelming, brute force across a front stretching thousands of miles. The instrument of this force was the T-34, now predominantly in its T-34-85 variant, produced in such staggering numbers that it ceased to be merely a weapon and became a geological event, an unstoppable tide of steel that began to roll west, washing away the German Ost here in a flood of fire and tracked vehicles. This tide was the physical manifestation of Soviet operational art perfected. The Red Army had mastered the deep operation on a scale unimaginable in 1941. An offensive was no longer a push along a narrow front, but a series of simultaneous, sledgehammer blows across a vast sector. The initial bombardment was apocalyptic, involving thousands of guns and Katyusha rocket launchers that systematically pulverized German forward positions, command posts, and communication lines. Then came the first wave. Massed infantry, often riding on the decks of T-34s, would assault the shattered German lines, overwhelming survivors through sheer weight of numbers. Their job was to create the breach. Once a crack appeared, the second, decisive echelon was unleashed, the tank armies. These were not mere divisions, but colossal, self-contained combined arms formations built around a core of hundreds, sometimes over 1,000, T-34s. They poured through the gaps in the German front like water through a ruptured dam. Their mission was not to fight pitched battles against every German strongpoint. That was the job of the following infantry. The T-34s, with their speed, range, and reliability, were to drive deep into the German rear, bypassing centers of resistance, and race for operational objectives: key river crossings, major road junctions, and supply depots. They operated on a scale of dozens of miles per day, severing German units from their supply lines and from each other, creating massive pockets, kessels, that were then systematically reduced by the following Soviet infantry. The German soldier, from the lowliest grenadier to the most experienced corps commander, faced a new and terrifying form of warfare. It was a war of constant, grinding pressure. A unit could be holding its line against a frontal assault, only to discover that T-34-led columns had already penetrated 50 miles to their rear and were cutting off their escape route. The psychological impact was devastating. The German army, which had once prided itself on its ability to outmaneuver and encircle its enemies, was now being systematically encircled and annihilated by the very same tactics, executed on a far grander scale. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, stands as the ultimate example. In a matter of weeks, the entire German Army Group Center, a force of over 300,000 men, was effectively destroyed. The roads west were choked with the burnt-out wrecks of German vehicles and the disorganized, fleeing remnants of what had been a proud army. On a tactical level, the T-34-85 had restored the balance. While a Panther or Tiger could still kill a T-34 from a longer range, it no longer enjoyed the near invulnerability of 1943. The 85mm gun of the T-34-85 was a credible threat, and the T-34's numerical superiority was absolute. German tank crews spoke of engaging endless waves of T-34s. They would destroy 5, 10, 20, but more would always appear, swarming around their flanks. A mechanical breakdown, a momentary shortage of fuel or ammunition, meant certain destruction. The qualitative edge of the German big cats was drowned in a quantitative ocean of Soviet steel. The logistical simplicity of the T-34 was a force multiplier that the Germans could not match. A broken-down Panther was often a total loss, requiring specialized recovery vehicles and a lengthy journey to a rear-area workshop. A broken-down T-34 could frequently be repaired by its own crew or a mobile field workshop with cannibalized parts from another wreck. Its V2 diesel engine sipped fuel compared to the gasoline-guzzling German tanks, a critical advantage given the ever-lengthening and increasingly vulnerable German supply lines. The T-34 was the perfect vehicle for a long-range, high-tempo offensive. The Panther and Tiger were not. The westward roll of the T-34 became the symbol of the Third Reich's impending doom. They crossed the pre-war Polish border, then the German border of 1939. They rolled through East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. They fought in the streets of Berlin itself, their distinctive silhouettes stark against the burning ruins of the Reich Chancellery. The farm tractor from the steppes had arrived at the heart of the Nazi beast. Each T-34 was a rolling testament to Soviet industrial might, a product of the evacuated factories beyond the Urals, now delivering final judgment on the invaders who had sought to destroy them. This unstoppable tide was more than just a military victory. It was the culmination of a national effort of survival and vengeance. The T-34 was not a delicate weapon. It was a blunt instrument of liberation and destruction. It carried the Red Army from the gates of Moscow and the ruins of Stalingrad to the very center of European power. The tens of thousands that rolled west were an avalanche, and by 1945, there was no force in the world that could stop them. They were the iron fist of the Soviet Union, and they had crushed the Wehrmacht into dust.